This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party. This episode is nestled into a series within a series exploring some economic issues that shaped conservative opinions in the 1970s and 80s. It may be worth ingesting this as part of the whole series. This is the failure of supply-side economics. In 1975, Republican President Gerald Ford's team was met with a problem. The cost of goods was going up while employment declined. Stuff cost more, but also fewer people had jobs and couldn't afford to buy things. So the Ford team proposed cutting taxes. Now here we are, 30 seconds into this thing, and I gotta reinforce something important. There was high inflation in the Ford administration, an average of 8%. That's good to remember because later we're going to talk about how high it was under Jimmy Carter. Usually when people talk about Jimmy Carter, they forget that there were financial issues around the Republicans who came before him. Okay, so back to Gerald Ford and his tax cuts. This announcement was met with guffaws in, believe it or not, conservative circles. They worried that if they lowered taxes, the federal debt would skyrocket. One influential Republican gave this speech. "The fact is, we'll never build a lasting economic recovery by going deeper into debt at a faster rate than we ever have before. It took this nation 166 years until the middle of World War II to find the accumulated debt of $95 billion. It took this administration just the last 12 months to add $95 billion to the debt." Worried about a tax cut? Concerned about growing the national debt? Any guesses who this is? Ronald Reagan, who just a few years later switched sides and lobbied for tax cuts that ultimately ballooned the national debt. I bring this up for a critical reason, because even as late as 1975, a lot of Republicans beat the drum not of tax cuts, but of paying down the debt, including Reagan, who, it's worth noting, fudged a bunch of data in his speech. The 1970s, when Reagan delivered his message and twice ran for president, were a time of ordeals. A lot of stuff just went haywire. Long lines at the gas pump during the Nixon and Carter administrations. Inflation met stagflation. Not to mention all the social upheaval we've covered already. Airline hijackings, revelations about Nixon, lies about the Vietnam War, social chains, on and on and on. It was also characterized by financial problems. For starters, inflation. Big-time inflation. It jumped over 10%, reaching 14% at its height in 1980, which is, no good. For comparison, the Federal Reserve's ideal is just 2%. 10 to 14 is a big deal. I know this is something we're all supposed to just understand, right? Inflation? But just as a reminder, inflation is, as the Federal Reserve put it,
ongoing increases in the general price level for goods and services in an economy over time.
In other words, if I go into the store today and I pay $100 in groceries, and next year I buy the same groceries, but now they cost $105, the difference between those, that $5 increase, is inflation. But spread across the whole economy, not just in my local store. In the 1970s and 80s, that cost was going way up. So if your grandparents tell you that they used to be able to get a piece of candy for a penny and now that candy is like $1, inflation is the reason why. Inflation means stuff costs more, which can be hard for people who have savings in the bank or under their mattress because that money is essentially losing value. It can't buy today what it bought a few years ago. Bringing us back to gas prices. The voice you're about to hear is historian Rick Perlstein, author of Reaganland.
You had the oil crisis that saw gas lines, shockingly, spreading across America, first in 1974 after the Arab oil boycott, after America supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and then again in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution.
Those upheavals in the Middle East upset gas prices in the United States because so much of our petroleum comes from that region. It wasn't just that gas was more expensive. A person could spend hours in line just trying to fill their car, semi, or bus. This was due, in part, to hoarding. Much like toilet paper during the COVID lockdowns. There was plenty to go around until people started stashing it away. That hoarding caused scarcity. Scarcity mixed with problems in oil-producing countries raised prices. Basic supply and demand. When the supply goes down and the demand goes up, prices rise. See, economics isn't that scary. This gasoline shortage came as a surprise to many.
Energy was not even seen as something that you could have a shortage of. It was just completely came out of the blue. In fact, one of Richard Nixon's science advisors said soon energy was so cheap you wouldn't be able to meter it. So what these were really for the generation that came of age after World War II, in which America was not only the most prosperous society in the history of humanity, but the one in which that prosperity was the most widely shared, suddenly dealing with the kind of recessions that people hadn't seen since the 1930s. And none of the technical means that economists quite confidently believe they could use to regulate the economy, to turn it into, return it back to its broadly shared prosperity, were working.
For decades, there was this prevailing economic theory. It's actually still used today. Keynesian economics. It sounds scary, but it's pretty easy to understand. The theory is named for John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who developed his ideas as a way to talk about the Great Depression. Essentially, it says that if the economy is in a slump, the government can spend money to boost it. If there's a boom, the government should lessen spending to bring things into equilibrium. And we've all lived through this recently. I'll give you an example. In 2020, the world was really worried about the effects of COVID-19, not just on health, but also on the economy. So in March and December of 2020, the Trump administration issued checks to eligible Americans, one for $1,200 and one for $600. Then in March of the next year, the Biden administration issued a third stimulus for $1,400. Again, back to supply and demand. The goal here was to increase one side of that equation, the demand. Their hope was that by giving normal people money, they'd want to spend it. That spending would then boost production of stuff like food and clothing. It would increase the demand for goods. More demand would mean more jobs, more factory work hours, and the economy should recover. That is Keynesian economics in action. If the economy needs a boost, the government should spend more to help out. By the way, for all the griping about Keynesian economics in recent years, both parties use it. Remember, those stimulus checks were supported by both Democrats and Republicans. But in the 1970s,
Keynesian economics was not working.
Despite their best efforts, the recession just kept lingering. Not only with inflation, but with stagflation, where prices were going up, but employment was trending downward.
So there was this kind of intellectual opportunity for right-wing entrepreneurs to come up with other solutions. And the one that kind of won the battle of ideas was the one that had the least evidence behind it, because basically it was the most simple to explain.
A new way of thinking about best practices in a recession. I'll just tell you now, their idea, supply-side economics, was bogus. But it would soon change the way American lawmakers talked about economic crises. This is where we encounter a small group of men, a kind of economics dinner club. They met regularly at a Wall Street bistro called Michael One to talk over their economic theories. Their philosophy boiled the woes of the 1970s down to two main causes: high taxes and the lack of a gold standard. The gold standard! You may remember it from last season. Once again, it's coming back up and becoming a part of the far-right philosophy. So let's do a quick recap. The gold standard was a guarantee from the government that a certain amount of paper money could be turned in for a fixed amount of gold. Like, literally, you could take your paper money in and year after year, it would get you the same exact amount of gold. The theory, also inaccurate, is that this would block the ability of the government to create money and limit its spending. They believed that inflation would be less likely if we locked the value of money at a certain fixed amount of gold. So these guys in the bistro wanted the gold standard back along with lowered taxes. Again, the idea was that if the government lowered taxes, it could actually make more money because spending and production would go up, and thus bring in more tax revenues in the long run.
There's two, lovely kind of stories about how this kind of seduced politicians. The one was in which Gerald Ford had an aide named Dick Cheney, and there was an economist who had basically been hounded out of the profession because his ideas were seen to be so crackpot, and he was making this claim that there's a point at which you lower taxes enough and revenues will increase, and it's called the Laffer curve.
Named for its creator, Arthur Laffer. He'd been a junior professor at, can you guess the school? That's right, it's our old friend, the University of Chicago. And then he joined President Nixon's Office of Management and Budget. He left Washington in disgrace after making a failed prediction. Later, he comes up with this justification for lowering taxes, the Laffer curve.
And it's so simple that he was able to draw it on the back of a napkin. He had to use a cocktail napkin because they were in a fancy expensive kind of restaurant where the napkins were all starched linen. But, Cheney was hooked. And first under Ronald Reagan and then under George Bush, he successfully advocated for supply side across the board tax cuts, which, didn't work, but they kept on, going back to the well. And the reason they were so attractive to the electorate was, well, who doesn't want money to be put in their pockets?
Arthur Laffer draws this curve on a napkin for Dick Cheney. Imagine a chart, one of those that looks like a capital L. The vertical axis represents tax rates. The horizontal one, the amount of money the government can bring in. He describes this rough scenario. If the taxes are 100%, then the revenues drop to zero, right? Since people aren't making money, they stop working, and the government brings in nothing. Same if the tax rate is zero. If the tax rate is nothing, they bring in nothing. Laffer argued that in between those two extremes is the sweet spot, where a certain rate brings in the peak amount of tax for the government. So far, this is actually an old idea from the 14th century. Laffer's innovation was to say that the US was on the downward part of the graph, where higher taxes produced less revenue. To get to that sweet spot, he said, we needed to lower taxes, especially for the wealthy. If wealthy people have more money, they would be more likely to invest it back into the economy. This, again, was based on nothing. And of course, I'll provide some proof. The time of the country's greatest economic growth was 1946 to 1972, right? The post-war boom, people buying houses, making babies, a car in every garage. During the time of the greatest growth in American history, the ultra-wealthy paid between 70 and 91%. Most years, it was in the 90s. And times were good. The supply side guys like to point out that JFK deeply cut taxes and everybody loves him, leaving out that those cuts brought in 1/3 of what they cost to implement. Plus, they were followed up by the Great Society, which buoyed people in the lower income brackets. In other words, the tax cuts didn't bring in more revenue, they increased the national debt. As economist John Quiggin wrote,
Laffer's analysis contained a mixture of correctness and originality. The Laffer curve was correct, but unoriginal. The Laffer hypothesis was original, but incorrect.
"Oh, sick burn, Professor Quiggin!" And he's not the only one with a negative review. Reagan's future VP, George H.W. Bush, called supply-side economics voodoo economics. Also, a pretty sick burn. That didn't stop the group from evangelizing the low-tax gospel. They spread their ideas through politicians and on the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Rick Perlstein wrote in his book Reaganland, Together, these four men arguably became the most influential economic thinkers in the history of the United States, even though their theories turned out to be substantially wrong. But it helped conservatives change their story.
But the government basically making policies that put money in your pockets was generally the province of Democrats. They would do things like big public works projects, right? They created jobs. They would do things like unemployment insurance. They would do things like Social Security. And it made conservatives extremely frustrated. So we can't win elections if this keeps on going on. The watchword was no one shoots Santa Claus, right? When the government acts like Santa Claus. But Jude Winitsky,
one of the guys at the bistro, a former card counter in Vegas, and then an editorial writer,
came up with what he called the two Santa Clauses theories. There's the Democrats' version of Santa Clauses, which is what the government, uses liberal economic policies to give you money. But we can have Santa Claus policy too. We can lower people's taxes.
Rather than be the guys always wanting to cut programs to pay off the national debt, why not be seen as the people giving citizens more from each paycheck? Instead of killing Santa Claus, you create a second one. Two Santa Clauses. This concept of cutting taxes to hopefully boost tax revenues is known as supply-side economics. Remember earlier when I talked about Keynesian economics, which had the government trying to stimulate demand in the market? This model does something different. Yes, give tax cuts to everyone, but you should really give tax cuts to the supply side, the people who create jobs, those who are already rich. Thus the name supply-side economics, because it seeks to boost supply rather than demand. You may know it by another name, either Reaganomics or trickle-down economics. The theory goes that if we put more money in the pockets of job creators, the money will then trickle down to the lower classes. It also advocates for deregulating businesses and cutting corporate taxes, steps to undo the liberal consensus that had been in place since the New Deal.
This really was kind of in tandem with the New Right, separate from the New Right, with a very different constituency than the New Right, because its biggest appeal was just to people who had no particular ideological passions at all, but, just wanted to pay their house notes, just wanted to, afford their taxes.
A message that Ronald Reagan picked up on and incorporated into his speeches, just a few years after he'd criticized Gerald Ford for wanting to lower taxes.
And this was a way that Ronald Reagan was able to say to everyone, basically, that if I'm elected, your economic prospects will improve. His big watchword in 1980 was, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And for enough people, that was the case, that people were willing to vote for this untested economic panacea, which, fails every time it's tried. But, times were desperate.
Supply-side economics hit the world stage at an interesting time. Tax cuts were in the air. The guys meeting in the bistro in 1973 had a long-term impact that informed the policies of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. But so did a movement coming out of California 5 years after the bistro econ sessions. This one known as Proposition 13. I'll continue the story after these messages. Maybe from big corporations seeking tax cuts. Who knows? If you like Truce, take a moment to review the show on your podcasting app and share it on social media. That's greatly appreciated. Okay, here come the ads. Hey friends, a few weeks ago I went to a fascinating talk where the guy who invented the infinite scroll told us about the future of AI. According to him, scientists are now predicting that we're just a few years away from the majority of the content on the internet being AI generated. It was a wild talk, and it reinforced to me how important it is to have real stories told by real people using reliable sources. And that's what Truce is. When it comes to fundraising, we're doing pretty well, but things are still pretty tight on this end. And I have a goal of someday hiring staff for the show. If you'd like to be a part of making Truce more sustainable, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. Even $10 a month goes a long way. Even if now's not the time for you to give money, there are so many ways to help out. For one, you can email your favorite history, religious, or chit-chat podcasts and suggest that they interview me for their show. 2, leave a 5-star review on your podcasting app. 3, post about Truce on social media. You can share an episode or one of the many videos I've been making on social media. Finally, and most importantly, remember the show in prayer. Thanks for listening to Truce, a real show made by a real person about real issues. Welcome back. Supply-side economics came of age in a time of stagflation. In the mid-1970s, lower taxes were not the drum that Republicans beat at every turn. They were much more concerned about cutting the national debt. But that wouldn't last much longer, because of a guy living on the West Coast who made a real stink and set the nation against taxes.
Proposition 13 is one of those stories that I love in history. It's just so laden with ironies and paradoxes.
Proposition 13 started in California. In the 1970s, the state saw a building boom as home prices grew by leaps and bounds. By 1976, the average home price in Southern California went up by 3% per month, what it usually rose in a year.
Places like California and Florida, one of the reasons they were able to succeed economically after World War II was, first of all, that's where they built a lot of the defense bases. Second of all, they were gorgeous and sunny. And third of all, they'd invented, cheap air conditioning that you could have in your home. No one wanted to move to Florida in the 1920s, but in the 1950s, it sounded great. Now in California in particular, property taxes started skyrocketing. So you'd have this, pensioner living in a home that they bought in, say, 1946 after they, came back from Iwo Jima, and it's worth 3 times as much. So they have to come up with 3 times as much in cash every year for this property that they can't sell. So it was really kind of a technical policy problem.
The challenge was to find a better way to tax people fairly, so that you're not running pensioners out of their homes. And people were working on that. How do we provide need to those who need it the most? Then came someone with an idea that sounded simpler. Mr. Prop 13.
This weirdo character named Howard Jarvis, he was a crackpot. He'd run for mayor in Los Angeles and come in like 5th place, and his platform was getting rid of public garbage collection. He would yap so much at county board meetings, they would have to turn off his microphone.
He tried and tried to get a ballot initiative through. Essentially one that would roll back property tax assessments to 3 years earlier, and then limit the rate of tax growth to 1%, capping it at about 2%. Then property value couldn't be reassessed until it was sold, meaning that your property tax rate couldn't go up unless you sold your house. In which case, whatever, it was no longer your problem.
And his ulterior motive was quite blatant. He was a libertarian and he wanted to destroy the revenue base of the state. In fact, when Proposition 13 passed, and one of its features that's still in effect is you have to get a supermajority of the legislature to raise any kind of tax. And this guy was an oddball. He would go on TV and he would say things like, I can't wait to ram a hot poker up these politicians' butts, right? And so when he finally managed to get this thing on the ballot, because people were so mad about their property taxes, the people running the campaign they hired the most sophisticated political consultants. They said, we've got to keep this guy as far as possible from a TV camera as we can. We got to have experts on the air. We have to make sophisticated, thoughtful arguments. This guy is a madman. But lo and behold, he would show up on this relatively novel medium of talk radio. Everyone in Los Angeles is listening to their radios when they're caught in traffic jams for 1-2 hour commutes. And he became a folk hero.
Not just in California, but all across the country. Jarvis's ballot initiative in California lit the fire of property tax cuts. Soon other states copied him, and major publications covered what they called the tax revolt.
Politicians got the message that people were so mad about taxes that they would do anything to stop them. So copycat initiatives rose up all over the country. And one of Howard Jarvis's biggest backers, who had kind of been with him for the first because he had similar ideas about raising revenue for government, happened to be running for president. His name was Ronald Reagan.
That guy who only recently criticized tax cuts because they would balloon the national debt?
And he was hailed as a prophet. Suddenly, with all these factors between, the property tax situation and the promises of income tax cuts for everybody, and this idea that all the scary social changes of the 60s that have had you fearing, for your daughter's virtue, that they could be addressed by this one incredibly charming guy who was this exquisite communicator, created a coalition that completely set American politics on its ear. Again, 3 years after all the pundits were saying that the Republican Party was going to go the way of the Whigs.
All of these forces gathered around the person of Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. The new right, who organized discontent around the sort of moral issues of the 1960s, and the supply side guys who wanted to cut taxes. Allow me to clarify, though. The supply side guys from this episode and the new right guys from the last one didn't always get along.
If anything, the people who were the avatars of the supply side economic ideology despised the new right. They despised the idea of introducing these so-called moral issues into politics. So, this was the source of more of a faction fight within the Reagan coalition than a point of unity.
The new right and supply-side economics were not necessarily the same thing. One wanted to make money by riling people up about moral issues. The other wanted to make money by lowering taxes, especially those on the rich. But they came together around the person of Ronald Reagan. Two different movements that found the same figurehead. Got it? Okay. Also, it's worth noting that the federal tax rates actually were much higher in the 1970s than they are today. That's key to understanding the appeal of these tax cuts. Okay, so get ready for some numbers. The top marginal tax rate reached 70% for the richest of the rich, and about 25% for median income owners. People, I'm guessing, like you and me. In 2021, the rate for the wealthiest people, and as we know, not necessarily what they paid, was just 37%. Almost half of what it was in the 1970s. The rate for people around the median income, people like you and me, was just 12%. Less than half of what it was in the 1970s. Federal income tax levels were way higher then. So when you hear people complaining about their federal income taxes today, it's nothing like what it was in the 1970s. Also, as we'll see later, the Carter administration tried to lower taxes. Democrats like him weren't immune to the excitement spurred by Proposition 13. But it wasn't until the Reagan administration that cuts made it through Congress. Let's slow down for a second and appreciate what we've covered today, because first, we've talked about a lot. Some of these ideas may seem esoteric, but they impact us right now, today. You can hear traces of supply-side economics at evangelical conferences or by listening to Donald Trump. This stuff is still the backbone of the Christian right today. Have you ever heard one of your loved ones or friends try to equate low taxes, anti-feminism, or libertarian ideas to Christianity? These are some of the reasons why. Because once Christians got brought together in the Republican Party, they adopted many of the GOP's concepts. We humans like to bundle things together. We find a tribe and we pick up whatever they go for. These ideas of supply-side economics and fear-mongering were already becoming part of the white evangelical world. So much of what bonded some evangelicals to the Republican Party has to do with money. Ideas that the government is too big or that taxation represents a loss of liberty. Last episode, we saw how some evangelicals were courted using scare tactics. In this episode, we covered how the party changed to embrace tax cuts at any cost in order to boost income for the wealthy. Next time, we'll talk about how libertarians and trade groups poured millions of dollars into ad campaigns targeting religious people to tie all this into a bow. Once again, let's return to the beginning of the season to ask if any of this stuff is biblical. What does the Bible, especially the New Testament, have to say about taxes? In summation, give to Caesar what is Caesar. Pay your taxes. What does it say about the rich and the dangers of wealth? Some pretty harsh things. Yet in the 1970s, some evangelicals found themselves partnering with anti-tax campaigns that disproportionately favored the wealthy. Soon, they'd back Ronald Reagan, who turned from preaching about lowering the national debt to ballooning it in his administration. What would these strange bedfellows bring? Would evangelicals resist the temptations of power and influence? Or would some of them succumb to the changing tides of public opinion? I'll continue the story in the next episode. Special thanks to Rick Perlstein. He's the author of several great books, and the ones I used in this series were The Invisible Bridge and Reaganland. They help clarify so many things for me about this era, and God willing, we'll be hearing more from him this season. For a full list of sources, check out the website at trucepodcast.com. While you're there, check out the catalog of previous episodes along with information about me and some of my previous work. You can also learn how to give a little each month to help me make this show. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate for information. Thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including Paul Hastings of the Compelled Podcast. I'm also indebted, as always, to my brother Nick Starrin, who had to hear me recount all of this stuff multiple times so I could get it straight in my head. Special thanks also to First Baptist Church of Jackson, Wyoming, for letting me record there, right here in the basement supply closet. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Starrin, and this is Truce.